We acknowledge the wrongs done to them by newcomers to this land, and we seek to be partners with them in righting these wrongs and in living together in peace and harmony with them and with the land, our common home. We look forward to the day when Australia will listen carefully to their voices, respect their wisdom, formally recognise the sovereignty they have never ceded, and extend to them the justice so long overdue. Okay. Well, today we have an especially tight program, and we're also a little depleted, as you can see. I don't understand how so many people could be, everything that could happen has happened. People have COVID, they're sick, they've been stuck in traffic jams, they're asking to go online, and quite a few people are joining us online who couldn't be here in person tonight. And many other issues have arisen to prevent some people being here in person. Now, our first, we're going to have 4 things happening today. First, we're going to have a dialogue amongst participants on climate change. Then I'll give a very short presentation on some ethical aspects of climate change. Then we'll have a break, then conversation groups, and I'll say more about that in a minute or a little later. And then hopefully something that I know many people have been looking forward to, a conversation with our guest, Tim Hollo. So the first thing we're going to do is have this dialogue on climate change. We're discussing the proposition to avert disastrous global warming, we need drastic changes to the politics, lifestyle, and consumption patterns of the affluent West. So it'll be very interesting to hear from everyone to see how they respond to that proposition. We were to have 4 speakers, but one of them has had to withdraw, unfortunately, for some emergency that she explained in an email either yesterday or today. So we have 3, 2 people here and 1 online. And I think it's best for the 2 people in this room to sit here. So Rudra can sit here if Rudra is here. Rudra has not arrived. Well, we'll keep going. Ava Brodnowski is joining us online. I hope that is the case. So, Ava, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Okay, good. All right. Well, what I suggest at the moment, we have two people who are with us. And so we'll give the microphone, so to speak, to David first, and then we'll go to Ava, and then we might have a brief conversation between the 2 of you, but we'll open it up to the floor after a little while. So, Dave.
Okay. All right. Okay, so are you sure? Because my voice is really weak. Okay. Okay. So what I'm talking about is the issue of climate change advocacy, the issue of trust. Challenges of climate change require action, often costly. And so far, too little is too slow.
Your amplifier on?
No.
Oh, sure.
No.
No?
No, it doesn't work.
Oh.
I was trying to say that. Instruction say do not use. But I'm giving it a shot.
That bit.
It's coming through there.
Oh, online.
Yeah.
But we're struggling here.
Yeah.
We're struggling to hear you here.
It's not working. There are people in the room.
No, that's going out, but not in the room.
Yeah.
Let me see. Will it conflict with this?
Yeah, I think. Okay. Okay, how's that? Right. Okay. So my topic is climate change and the issue of trust. The challenges of climate change require action, as we know. Sadly, so far, responses have been too little and or too slow. Coordinated global action is needed, but parochial concerns and international tensions make international cooperation critical. A serious barrier to action, significant distrust of climate scientists. Well, there's a sheet on the one sheet on each table, which is where I'm reading from. Money is very heavily dependent on fossil fuels and especially investors. Significant voices that oppose climate action play on this distrust. If climate scientists are just not trusted, what do we do? How can we overcome this distrust? My answer is to give attention to the climate policies of engineering institutes. Engineering institutes have the training, experience, and resources to assess scientific issues. They can point to infrastructure and time that they design as physical evidence of competence. They can't easily be dismissed as having a vested interest in climate change. They can't easily be dismissed as having a psychological need to support a cause. And they have established international recognition. I suggest two institutes in particular. First is Engineering Australia, which is Australia's national body for engineering, with 130,000 plus members. Engineering Australia recognises the scale and urgency of the challenges presented by climate change, the disruptions it caused, and the pivotal role of engineering in enabling a socially just transition to a sustainable society. The other main institute is IEEE, which was originally the USA-based Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and they include many other professions. It's the world's largest technical organisation with over 460,000 members. A particular advantage with these larger institutes is they have substantial websites of their wide areas of interest. It's really possible to go onto the website and to build a feel of the organisation and having a wide range of interests and capabilities and long involvement in public policy. Seeing this can enable one to make an assessment of institute competence and trustworthiness, and only then should the person having established their trustworthiness, should the person take interest in the climate change policies. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Ava, who's joining us online.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Wait, I missed his name. Was that Joseph? No. Well, thank you to the speaker. Am I audible?
Yes.
So we can't see you.
Can we spotlight?
No. There we are. We can see you very well.
All good? Yep, okay. Wonderful. So first of all, I took quite a different approach, I think, to the last speaker. I took kind of a more philosophical approach to this question, I think. As a result, a lot of ideas, oh, sorry, let me mute my notifications. Technology. Okay. As a result, I think a lot of my ideas are condensed into quite a short speaking space, but I'll do my best. Another disclaimer is that I'm not very hopeful. I'm quite cynical about this issue. Okay. Cool. So I'll just start now. Obviously, we need drastic changes to the politics and lifestyles of the affluent West if we are to avert catastrophic climate change. But there's always a tension, it seems, between the individual's agency to change the world and the prevailing power structures that inhibit the scope of that agency. So it seems to me we need a collective shift, one that compels not only individuals to change, but also governments and corporations, all of which I think share the quality of being systems with goal-driven behavior. This quality is something I think that we can exploit. In all cases, it is our understandings of the world and our place within it that informs how we or other systems behave. So frankly, I'm not hopeful, but in what follows, I'll try to pursue a kind of methodology that employs an extreme lack of hope to maybe find the one thing that I think we can be hopeful about, kind of like how Descartes employs extreme doubt to find the one thing of which he can be certain. Right, so first, can we be hopeful that governments all around the world will soon enough collectively act to change policies that allow the destruction of the planet? Probably not. Can we be hopeful about the imminent dissolution of companies that drive the extraction of fossil fuels upon which large swathes of the population are still dependent? Also, probably not, in my view. There is one thing I think is likely to happen, however, even though it requires significant destabilization to bring about perhaps speculative benefits. Okay, so I suspect that climate change will get worse before it gets better, but that the intensification of catastrophe combined with rapid acceleration of technologies like artificial general intelligence will just be so paradigm shifting to the individual's lives, I suppose, that it causes a change in mass subjectivity, kind of a revolution in what we actually think it means to be human beings. So why is this hopeful? Well, because if habits and behaviors on individual or collective levels stem from an understanding of the world and our nature within it, then this grand shift in subjectivity can be a hopeful one. It is one that may compel us to do what is necessary to survive. The question then, at last, is as we kind of face our existential looming threat, is what might that shift in mass subjectivity look like? Here's one thought. So I think it might look like an expansion of the kind of inalienable value that we tend to place on human lives in a human rights framework to more unfamiliar forms of life, like animals or even plants and ecosystems. And that would generate more ethical imperatives to take care of those systems as though they have rights in a similar way to our fellow human beings. I think the other thing it would do and would have to do is or challenge massively the privilege that we place on human intelligence and sentience as opposed to other forms of intelligence and sentience. I think all of these things are good things. I don't have time to elaborate more, I think, but I'm very curious as to what others might think a new mass subjectivity should look like. And I think it kind of models something like how the degree of existential change that was ushered in by something like the Copernican revolution, when we suddenly realized we weren't the center of the universe. So that's a very philosophical existential sketch of my approach to climate change in light of not having much hope. Thank you.
Third one on paper meeting 67.
I'm sorry?
If you want a third one, you've gone from 4 to 2. I'm prepared to try.
Just check. Rudra is not here or online. So I don't know what's happening. Right, you can make the contribution. Why not?
I would like to sign on. This is totally off the top of the head, so excuse the nervous one. Climate change is what's called a super wicked problem. Wicked problems are where the complexity is such that there is no obvious solution. Things like social welfare are a wicked problem. Who do you give the money to? How much do you give to them? This goes across timescales, pre and post our generation. It goes across all levels of government, from your local government right up to national and world government and corporations, corporate governments. It goes across equity issues, first generation issues, national issues. It's a very complex problem. And that leads me on, and the super wicked problem is where those that are trying to solve the wicked problem are also the ones causing it. This leads, I think, to a cognitive dissonance. I'm guessing most people probably know what it is. Very briefly, the human brain seems designed that when it has two incompatible realities in its head. So one is climate change is so bad, I've got to act right now. I've got to stop driving petrol cars, throw a job in, just act on nothing else but this. The other one is I've still got to feed the kids, keep the job going, and no one else is doing anything. The government's opening new coal mines and so on. We are designed to take the easier way out, to keep our head in the sand. And I think 95% of the world is doing that at the moment. The other 5 to 10% at one end, they have the knowledge, the heads of Exxon government and so on, but they're basically proceeding with rape and pillage because they think they will be right. At the other end, it's people getting out there, often students and elders, because the middle range of people seem too caught up in just living their lives, and they're actually putting themselves on the line, being arrested, doing active civil disobedience. That seems to be the only way to get change. Another big factor I want to stress is the time lag in this. I must say I agree immensely with what David said, and I'm very pessimistic too. I'm the world's worst project manager. I'll leave everything till 1 minute past midnight. Even I can see this is a project management issue, and if I can, why aren't those who are supposed to lead us on this and supposed to look ahead doing it? There is a substantial time lag between when we put the extra blanket up of the extra CO2 and methane and other gases, and the Earth's temperature, it's called black body radiation, rising hot enough to accumulate that heat radiation back into space. So what we're seeing now in terms of disasters are nothing. These are what we did 50 and 100 years ago. We haven't begun to see what we've locked in since then, let alone that we're still adding to the problem dramatic at all-time peak rates. 1.5 degrees is not a safe temperature rise. That will see the loss of 48 of 52 island states. It will see massive disruption of human society on all sorts of fronts: water wars, food wars, massive migration. American military did research. Is it time up?
Soon, very soon.
Okay. Showed that 2 degree rise is incompatible with human civilization as we know it. I think we're well and truly heading for that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. More comfortable. Now, Emily, we're going to get more people from the floor and online in here. We'll take a couple from here perhaps first, and then a couple from those who are joining us online. And because it's open up now for anyone to make a comment. If you can stick to the proposition, what you agree with and what you don't, that might be helpful as well. So, who would like now to make a contribution? Yes. What do you want people to do?
For the sake of the online audience, could you just come a bit closer to the front?
You can speak from here.
Yes.
Must say I was reassured to hear someone talking about being pessimistic. I think that's something I find with being involved in various areas of activism. It's sort of following on from the positivity sort of culture that, you know, if we just do some things, things will will work out all right. So thank you for that. I think it's a dose of reality. So the question is then, to keep ourselves going with sufficient level of hope, I think there are things where a lot of people are doing all the time, with this working in the expectation that's probably going to fail. Well, that's the reality. I think the things that we're doing in the context of the larger collective subjectivity that we talked about, the probability is that we're waiting for bigger movements to take place. That's my interpretation.
Who else would like to have a go? Don't all rush, that's okay. Yes. Do you want to come here or?
Okay. What about this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. I just want to add a bit from my perspective as an aviation professional. In the aviation sector, there are standards, international standards for noise and fuel emission from aircraft containing one of the International Civil Aviation Organization's annexes, and they're being progressively improved and progressively implemented by all the member states, which is most of the world. However, in the military, no such standards exist at all. So designers of military aircraft can create as many emissions and noise as they want. So I see this as a major impediment, and we never hear from politicians anywhere about the effects of military aviation on the climate, which is a lot worse than the civil, I can tell you. And just talk about that in the current conflict in Ukraine, the first thing that the collective Western governments did, and a few cronies, was to impose restrictions on aircraft transiting Russia. So now most carriers that fly from the Far East to Europe have to do about an average a 2-hour detour. And this in my view is a bit ridiculous, and in fact most of the American airline CEOs now are complaining about it because they see it as unfair competition, because the Chinese aircraft and whatever and a few others do still transit Russia, which saves them an extra 2 hours fuel cost on every trip. So again, under international regulations, there's requirements to facilitate flight paths over every country in the world. And it's funny, I think this is the first time I can remember, except for maybe in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, where a country's been restricted from collecting fees for overflights, which is actually the real reason why they're not allowed. So yeah, I just sort of put that in from the aviation perspective to for anybody that doesn't understand, to get thinking about where these emissions are actually coming from, and the sort of negligence, in my view, in government in governments around the world for acknowledging the fact.
Thanks very much. Anyone online would like to add their comments? Don't be bashful. Have we got any takers so far? Oh.
Yes, there's someone.
All right. Who is it?
Christian.
Christian.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi. In the interest of perhaps trying to inject an element of hope, or I think hope is where you can see a path forward. Unfortunately, in conversations like the one we're having, we often resort to two things. We either resort to listing the problems with ever greater precision, which of course is pretty depressing. And the second thing we often do is make a wish list of things we would like to see happen. I would very much like to see the conversation shift away from those two standard forms of discourse. One, a list of the problems amounting to a crisis. And secondly, a wish list, like a Christmas list. I wish that a government would do this, or I think if we wait for government to intervene appropriately, we'll almost certainly end up with a catastrophe. But what we're really asking government to do, if I understand correctly, is to implement decisions which would be binding on us. And I don't see any in principle reason, plenty of in practice reasons, why we couldn't self-organize en masse, perhaps beginning very at small scale, and make, as it were, social contracts with one another as members of the society, as the citizenry, to act and not act in certain ways. In other words, to pledge to one another that we would do certain things without waiting for a set of regulations to be imposed on us from the next elected government, which is very, very unlikely to happen, as many speakers would say. Now, even if that's a terrible idea, and I suspect there's a lot of holes in it, and it hasn't been thought, what I'd really like to hear from people, perhaps beginning tonight and in the future, is to move the discussion away from a list of problems and a wish list towards a list of potential actions that we could take. I'll leave it there.
Anyone else from, thanks, Christian. Anyone else from our online participants? No? Anyone else from here? Yes, please, come.
Oh, can everyone hear me okay?
Is it on?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I agree. I think that was a really good point by Christian. Like, how do we move away from listing the obvious and repeating the same cycles? But I think on the topic of self-organizing, one of the things that I find fascinating, I'm a law student at the moment, and I really find the idea of regulation of of corporate organizations in the environment, social governance space really interesting. One of the things, though, is the challenges with trying to regulate or self-regulate. A lot of the times when organizations are asked to, count their emissions or report on their performance, they tend to actually underreport their emissions. And then they come up with innovative solutions like carbon offsetting. I don't know if people are familiar with that. It's where you basically can purchase carbon credits and say, oh, we're making a lot of emissions. However, we're going to purchase carbon credits, and that basically goes towards planting a tree somewhere in Brazil. And so you can make more emissions, but discount it by planting trees. And I find that an interesting solution. I think it's something that regulators are constantly looking at and reviewing. How do we create impetus for organizations and individuals to do the right thing while being financially viable in their operations? I think it's something that's quite complex. And as was noted before, it is something that is going to take a lot of cross-cultural, cross-jurisdictional conversations and agreement. And I think it's not an easy process, but it's interesting to watch it explore in the corporate space, which is one of the most liberal spaces. And also, I think it just invites us to question our own habits and our own practices. One of the challenges that I had this year was I buy a lot of clothes. And so I thought, oh, I need to be more sustainable. I do all these like green initiatives at work. How can I implement that without being imposed? And so I've taken a little liking to op shopping. And that's something that challenges me because like, I've got an event on, like, let me go and buy something new. And I think, oh no, I'm trying to be more sustainable. I'm trying to do the right thing. So I think it's a self-reflection exercise as well. And I welcome Christian's invitation to us to question, you know, it's so easy to point the finger at big corporations, big mining giants, big organizations, government. But when do we inwardly look within and say, how am I contributing to excess waste, and how can I actually change a little bit of my lifestyle to better reflect my goals for sustainability and addressing climate change. So those are just a few of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Wait for a minute. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said. Christian, your talk was a bit of a conversation stopper for me, I'm afraid, but I agree with what you said. I just want to make a few quick observations. I agree. I've seen everything tried really in 45 years of activism, but I think one fertile area is that area. How surprising it is that a lot of corporate regulation has brought some environmental change. I think that's one of the fertile grounds for change. But the other two things I was going to mention is one, we're all grief-stricken. And how do you talk about that with hope? You know, and it's very hard to talk about it. And maybe we need a language for talking about, you know, I don't know what they do on the brink of war, you know, but how do you talk about hard things with hope? And, you know, maybe we need new language. I certainly don't like talking to my kids about it. And then the third thing I just want to say was I was in Singapore recently, and one of their major tourist attractions, they had a sort of at the end of it, they had to sort of screen off to the side. And it was the most powerful thing I've seen. It was Singapore 2024, 26, 28, through what's going to happen in climate change, and ended with a sort of sterile dust storm. And, you know, that's the sort of message that needs to be out there. And I think that I was really sort of surprised that Singapore is the only government that I've seen do that. Thanks.
Anyone else? Online, anyone else? We'll come to you in a moment. Anyone else online?
Just for the sake of the people in the room, Ada, did you want to say what you wrote in the comments?
Sure. It's very simple. I was just going to say I'm definitely hopeful that human beings will survive. I think that we're quite stubborn, very adaptive species, but I suspect that there will be just so much chaos before there is stability. So yeah, I suppose there's just some degree of loss that seems inevitable, and that's yeah, I think that's what people grieve, I suppose, when we think about this issue.
Well, we had, unless there is anyone else, oh, you wanted to say a quick word. Yes, a quick word.
Ava, I'm hoping for your massive awakening. The trouble I see is that this lag that I mentioned, that we are hitting tipping points, and there's some 26 tipping points that are just irreversible once you go over them. Things like melting the Arctic goes from an albino of 98% or something to 20%, so it's then absorbing heat. And Christian, 2 points to answer yours, but 1 point, in fact, just before that, what we need to do is build the reverse of the biggest industry mankind has actually, this is one of the answers, the biggest industry mankind has ever built, the petrochemical industry. We have been putting 45 billion tons of carbon dioxide up. We need to build an industry with technologies we do not have to start drawing that down. We also, Christian, are going to need to face geoengineering and adopting techniques that will give us time, such as shading sections of the earth to stop the heat, even though it doesn't change the CO2. So to do that, we need to move the Overton window for our politicians so that they then think, the Overton window, sorry, is the range of actions politicians see that they can act in. So they're like a rock and they've got a balloon on it and they can just move this far. We need to move the rock for them so that they can achieve these things. The other thing, Christian, is things like Extinction Rebellion. It seems that one of the only things that actually gets action from our governments is non-violent civil disobedience. So there you go.
Yes, thank you. Now, we had said we've given, we've had a good set of comments, I think, not all in agreement, which is very good, but different perspectives. Now we were going to, I think, close this part of our session this evening by asking 4 people who volunteered. I'm assuming they're around. We'll soon find out. Miles Jones, Sobur Dew, Maureen Todd-Hunter and Catherine Hutchison. Miles, you're here. Give us your impression of what's been said.
Thank you to everyone who spoke. It's very interesting. Let's start by taking a deep breath and to recognize that we're all here in the conversation. It's beautiful art on the wall. We have lovely food and there's nature outside. So I have a few comments to make. The first one is that I think Joseph highlighted the prompt earlier, that we need drastic changes to politics, lifestyle, and consumption. I didn't hear many people disagree with the statement that we need that, so I think it's taken for granted that that's the case. What we spoke about mostly was how we might get there, or I think largely the challenges in doing so. And some of the solutions that were posited were quite interesting, but I thought there was a trend across a number of them in terms of David's comments on engineering institutes, Ava's on exploiting goal-driven behavior, Michael's on it being a project management issue, that these are largely sort of systemic ways that we're looking to address it again, rather than considering what we might do as people in this room or as a culture. So I thought the comments around from Sober on practices that she was taking to reduce her consumption. I'm guessing similarly there are many others in this room who have reduced their own flying, driving, eating, animal agriculture, these sorts of things. Or also the comment on Extinction Rebellion were interesting. Another point that came up was around this lack of hope. One thing that occurred to me is that we're actually very bad at forecasting the future, right? And I think there's been a lot of forecasting in this conversation. You know, one of the comments that came out was, we're going to fail. Things are going to get a lot worse. There's going to be catastrophes. You know, if this was 1945 or so, or, you know, there's going to be a nuclear war, a lot of people might have said. Again, we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I think we have to focus on what we can do. And perhaps the final comment I would add is, again, coming back to culture, there hasn't been much in the way of imagination in terms of what a positive future might look like or how things might shift. I liked Ava's thought around extending a human rights framework for plants and animals, these sorts of things. I thought that was very imaginative. Something I read recently is that in culture, we've actually become a lot more prone to being very doomsday about things. If we consider our film and TV outputs, there's a lot more dystopia or nostalgia than there is utopia, which is interesting because there used to be utopian products, right? And when I was living in London opposite one of the art galleries, there was this amazing mural that had been put up by a university student of, it was basically like a whole bunch of people living in sort of trees in like clothing made from, I don't know, animal skins or these sorts of things. But again, I think if we challenge ourselves to think imaginatively in a positive sense about what the future might look like, to consider our own actions, to consider what we can do in this room, then it will sort of break it down a bit. But on the whole, I thought it was a very interesting discussion, lots of diverse viewpoints. So thank you all.
Thank you. Now, Maureen online, you're there to share an impression with us, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yes. Okay, thank you to everyone who's contributed to this discussion. It has been highly interesting. As I see it, it has two dimensions. One is the practical side, on which I'm not so savvy. The other side is conceptual philosophical, and that's where I give more of my thought and attention. I think it is the conceptual philosophical side that actually goes to the heart of ethics. Since we're talking here about ethics, let's talk, I think, about or consider the conceptual, the philosophical. I think some of the speakers hedged around it, but didn't actually use the word, which for me is instrumental in this discussion, and that's ideology. I think when we recognize the dominance of neoliberalism, which constrains the capacity for collective action, neoliberalism, which views the world as competing individuals, obviously, as competing individuals, we cannot consider how to approach this task. We cannot consider the task at all, let alone how we might approach it. Whereas if we approach through an understanding of collective action, we are here together with and for each other. We have shared interests. I think it's with that perspective, and only with that perspective, that we can even consider the task ahead of us. I think what's also intrinsic to this discussion is the notion of capitalism, because capitalism is about maximizing consumption. It's about maximizing profit. And as long as they are the goals, the imperatives to maximize consumption, we are literally gobbling up the earth. And that's patently unsustainable. So for me, I think to conceptualize around the need for an ideological shift, and I think some of the speakers have suggested how we might consider this through collective action and so forth. One of the last speakers mentioned the need for new language. I agree absolutely, because it's in the language, in the discourse, in the story, the narrative, how we tell this story, that we can possibly embed a different ideological approach. Or perhaps this is grand wishful thinking on my part, but I think I have to think wishfully and do my best in practice and thought. So that's what I'm thinking. Thank you, everyone who contributed. And thank you, Joe, for giving us such a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Now, Sabur here? Yes.
I don't think I have much of value after Miles and Maureen, to be honest, but just to reiterate that I did find it to be a very, very interesting and enriching discussion. I particularly liked the framing around the dichotomy between pessimism and optimism. We feel pessimistic because we know the reality, and yet we have to be optimistic because as human beings, we need a reason to live on. I agreed that I thought the approaches were interesting, particularly David's point about the trusting engineering associations. It makes sense because they're the most technologically knowledgeable. But I think that also raises the question of how ethical standards are embedded in the practice of engineering, particularly as it pertains to climate change issues, because I know that engineering is quite a broad field. Some of them are more focused on sustainability and others are more profit driven. So I think there's a lot of necessary pre-steps that need to be taken before we can fully trust a body, especially if it's operating under the capitalistic structure. But I thought it was an interesting point. The second speaker who spoke about the under the philosophical approach, how a paradigm shift is needed. I agree 100%. And I thought it was interesting how she approached it by saying the paradigm shift will come about because of environmental destruction and technology. And I think it's really kind of frightening to think about that. At what point does the environment need to be destroyed for us to take action? Because right now the environment is being destroyed, but I guess it's very difficult for us to move away from our own subjectivity. So when a mining company is destroying traditional lands, you have some news anchors mocking, the spirituality of the land and people's hurt to that land. And yet, we're very okay with the environment being degraded in other parts of the world, out of sight, out of mind. So at what point would we collectively agree that we are in an environmental catastrophe when it affects our own day-to-day lives? So I thought it was very interesting. Technology, what will technology's role be in helping us fix the climate change issue? To what extent can technology be trusted, particularly against the backdrop of last week's discussion with AI and all the scary stuff that's associated with that? So I think it raises a lot of ethical issues. But I do agree. I think there's going to be a pinch time. There's going to be a crunch time where we're going to take the issue more seriously. And I'm just curious to see what the different approaches would be. And I agree with a lot of the audience comments were very interesting, especially framing it as an ideological approach. How can we address climate change and threats to our earth when we still live in an environment that encourages more exploitation of resources, that views land through the lens of ownership rather than through collective use and collective ownership? So I thought that was interesting, and I think those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for the discussion.
Thank you. And for this part of the conversation, we're going to give the last word to Catherine Hutchison. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Yes, I've got the final straw. I do apologise. I'm sorry, I can't hear. I do apologise that I couldn't hear what David said because the sound was very distorted. So I apologise if I haven't included him. I think that we've covered every subject regarding climate change except one. And I didn't hear anything about that this is a spiritual. It's a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual problem. A lot of people are saying that that's what climate change is, our attitude to climate change, and that we need to acknowledge much more that we're part of a common home and that everything, not just us, is in this. We've heard about the grief. We've heard about the denial. And this is one of the problems that, as someone said, we're in cognitive dissonance. We just can't move on this subject. And I think all the topics, the philosophical, the technological, I personally don't think technology is going to sort this problem out. And what's come over is we're waiting for a movement to get us going, and that's not going to be government. Like somebody said, we need to be at the grassroots. It needs to be us, civil society. We're the only ones who can do it. So the more of us that actually do something to change the way we live, which we have to do, we have to acknowledge that our lives are going to change. And that's a terrible grief. It's terribly sad that we're having to leave that behind, and we can't imagine a different way of life. So that's all I want to say on that. But thank you very much for all the comments.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I think it's been a very interesting. Well, I think we should give everyone who participated a clap, and not least those who listened, because listening skills are also very important. Well, a lot of what has been said, well, has more or less stolen my thunder, but not entirely. So bear with me as I run through a couple of issues which I think need to be highlighted as we think about climate change. And I've emphasized again, it's the should question. What should we do? We know that it is an existential threat, but what the existential threat does is that it poses most fundamentally not a technological challenge, not an economic challenge, not a political challenge. It poses all of those, but underlying it all is an ethical challenge. It's the supreme, it is the critical ethical challenge we are facing. Of a kind, a scale, a kind and a scale that we have not experienced before. What is it that makes climate change ethically unique? And one of the things that it does uniquely in the scale and the way it does it is that it crosses the boundaries of space and time. It crosses the boundaries of space and time. And that puts new meaning into what we understand by ethical responsibility. So that's really what my few words is going to be about. Climate change is a global phenomenon. It matters because it is global. Once emitted, greenhouse gas emissions can have climate effects anywhere on the planet, regardless of their source. And no community, no country, regardless of what it does, can put a shield around itself from with its own unaided efforts. Therefore, addressing the threat of global warming is the common responsibility of all humans. All humans share that one responsibility. The responsibility, joint responsibility for humanity's future. And more, as we shall see. And we have the knowledge which confirms the nature and scale of that responsibility. And we know this by virtue of the science, roughly called climate science, but it involves just about all of the sciences, including social sciences, that human intelligence has created. We have the intelligence that tells us what the scale of the responsibility is. So it's a global responsibility, but it's also a historical responsibility, which encompasses past and future. it crosses time boundaries. Climate change has a history. It is the consequence of the Industrial Revolution and the immense production and consumption of energy which it unleashed. And here we are dealing with industrialization, population growth, primarily in Europe and then the United States. The key centers, we have to think about this, the key centers of imperial power in the modern world. Climate change is closely connected to empire building from the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries and early 20th. In other words, climate change has to do with a history of colonization. Now, if we can show the first diagram, there it is, you can see that by 1887, the United States overtook Britain as the world's leading CO2 emitter. It was the United States and Germany, but the United States has increasingly, into the 20th century, became by far the largest emitter. So the US, UK, Germany, France, to a lesser extent. And even as late as 2022, the United States was still the largest emitter of CO2. And we can see that in the next slide, the shares of cumulative CO2 emissions between 1850 and 2002. And you can see that US and Europe, well over half of the world, with about 8% of the world's population. And in any case, the others include the likes of Russia. By 2000, of course, China had made its leap forward from the late 70s to 2000. So it begins to feature. Not a great deal, but it begins to feature. So historically, the ethical responsibility weighs heavily with the West. And the key ethical principle that applies is stop doing harm and clean up the mess. Stop doing the harm you've caused and clean it up. All the more so as it is these Western countries that have been the greatest beneficiaries of fossil-fueled economic growth. And that much of that growth was made possible by the labor, the cheap labor and raw materials of the colonized world. Africa, Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, with one or two notable exceptions, of which Japan, until recently, was the main one. So historical responsibility on climate change must be informed by considerations of justice. Stop doing harm may not be enough in justice terms. Not enough to just stop doing harm. You have to be accountable for the harm you've done in the past. Not just stop doing it now. And this will involve either restitution or reparation. So the question of ethical responsibility is challenging. And it is more challenging still if we think about it. We are all vulnerable to the effects of climate change, that's obvious. But we are not equally vulnerable, at least for now and the foreseeable future. The most vulnerable communities and countries to the effects of climate change are those which are likely to experience severe climate effects. And they cluster in what are called major regions of risk. In parts of Central America, Asia, some parts of Asia, and the Middle East, and in Africa across the Sahel and Central and East Africa. And to add to the list of particular concern to Australia, the Pacific Islands. And it's precisely these regions, it's the irony of history, which are likely to feel the brunt of these effects, which are least able to do much about. They lack the economic resources, they lack the technical infrastructure, and they lack the governmental and other institutional arrangements needed to deal with climate change. And the irony is, these are the very countries that have emitted the least historically and whose emissions continue to be low today. So, the international community has moved. There's no question there's been movement. And has adopted the radical principle of what is called common but differential responsibilities. That's an accepted principle. No one dare stand up, at government level at least, or international organizations, say, excuse me, I don't support common but differentiated responsibilities. Of course, there are other ways of getting it around. And what is the principle? The principle is that the more privileged must do more of the heavy lifting than the vulnerable to bring about greenhouse gas emissions to an end, however painful it may seem to those who are the more affluent. And it may be difficult to stomach that pill. The more privileged must cover a good deal of the cost, the sacrifice, which the vulnerable will incur as they go about taking effective climate action of their own. Now, it won't surprise, I don't think, any of you, that principle is now enshrined in numerous declarations and conventions, but its observance is in the breach. More in the breach than the observed. So the principle is there, we made some headway, but in practice, a long way to go to actually implement the principle. So historical responsibility. And then there is intergenerational ethical responsibility. Stop doing harm has another dimension. You have to think about it. Our actions can harm those who are living now, but they can also harm those who are not yet born. And the harm done to them may be greater than the harm being done to those that live now. It's as simple as that. It follows that future generations, from an ethical standpoint, must be part of the equation. One future life has to count as much as a current life. Around the table, their voices have to be equal. And to make matters worse, there are more of the unborn ones than the living ones. So in practice, more voice to those who have yet to be born than those who already live. Because over 100 years, there'll be so many more people, assuming no catastrophe prevents that from occurring, even with lower population growth than we have now. So, intergenerational responsibility requires us to have the structures, the institutions, the processes, where the voices of those who are yet to be born come through loud and clear. Just in case you thought this was easy. And then there is ecological responsibility. Climate change threatens not only humans, it threatens other animal species, and it threatens nature as a whole in potentially devastating ways, not just humans. And so steps ethically need to be taken not to inflict suffering on other sentient beings with whom we share the planet. we have to prevent the suffering that global warming will inflict on them unless we take action. And as we know, climate change is already affecting species in terrestrial freshwater and ocean ecosystems around the world. Future warming will make the impact worse. More frequent and more severe extreme events, droughts, floods, fires, along with habitat degradation, changes in water cycles, heat stress, will challenge many animal species, some of them at least as much as human beings. Climate change intensifies the competition for life for scarce resources. You follow that? It makes it harder. It's as if they're fighting each other instead of helping each other. But now the problem is this for human beings. How much responsibility can you place on birds or tigers or elephants? Not a great deal. You can't say to them, now you fix it. When it comes to fixing, it falls entirely on humans. That's the load. The ethical load is a very heavy one, and there is no point trying to make it easier, because we can't share it with anyone. The ethical responsibility. In other words, it has to be a case, and some people have already in the comments alluded to this. There needs to be a culture that has reverence for environment, for nature, for the earth community. And for this, we have much to learn from indigenous wisdom. We desperately need it. Desperately. We need them so much more than they need us. We need to think of that. And in case you thought that exhausts all the ethical issues, one other big one to put on the table: the precautionary principle. How should we act in situations where there exists uncertainty? And there is uncertainty. Science doesn't have all the answers, not yet anyhow, as to what are the likely harmful consequences, where, when, to what extent. We may not know with precision whether a certain harm will eventuate in some place, or if it does, how severe that harm will be. We can't pretend that we know all the answers. But the ethical issue is that if there is any likelihood that the anticipated harm will be very severe, any likelihood, doesn't have to be 50%. It can be only 5%. The precautionary principle requires that nothing be done which risks inflicting severe harm, even if the risk is only 5%, 4%. Even when the risk is low. Ethically, the precautionary principle says you always err on the side of caution. You don't play Russian roulette with climate change, nor do you do that with nuclear weapons. Russian roulette. Now, in dealing with all these ethical questions, you can put them all there, and I could add one or two more, but it isn't enough. It can't be determined by fiat. One bright person, 6 bright people, or not so bright, say, well, this is what we're going to do. Because that's not ethical. It will not be ethically determined that way. There is only one way in which it can be determined, the specific actions to take or not take, and that is through extensive public deliberation. This is an area, a subject of such global and historical significance that it has to involve huge sections of the human population into extensive public deliberation in a spirit of dialogue. That's what we need to cultivate. And so the last question. Okay, you've stated all these principles, ethical principles, and no doubt there may be some others. Who has the responsibility to do something about them? Who has ethical responsibility? Who? Well, a lot of these have already been mentioned. At one level, it's clearly nations, right? And the governments that purport to run the affairs of the nation. They purport to run the affairs of the nation. Don't be so sure that they in fact do. They may just be little pawns on the puppets on a string. But nevertheless, governments, they certainly rubber stamp a decision. Parliaments do legislate. And it's not just national government, but provincial government, by which we mean state government in Australia, but called different things in different countries, a different layer of government, and then municipal or local government. So they're important. And so are international governmental institutions. We know many of them: the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Union, ASEAN, Pacific Islands Forum, etc., etc., etc. So national levels of government and multilateral levels of organization. And then business organization. And then, importantly, very importantly, the professions. The medical profession, the legal profession, the teaching profession, and so on and so on and so on. Critical. They must have within their charters a climate change charter. Each of them, without fail. And then the same for media institutions. Now, of course, the question then arises, yes, but what if they don't want to exercise their ethical responsibility? Which is quite possible. And that's why, and again, this comment was made by more than one participant, at the end of the day, the weight of ethical responsibility weighs on the shoulders of civil society. Civil society, through its various organizations, it could be sporting, cultural, educational, religious, whatever. And at the end of the day, the individual person. Now here we've got to be careful, and I end with this. The individual person doing just their own individual thing? No, that's not ethical responsibility. Of course, we do things that we can personally do. We might reduce our travel, the distances we travel. We may eat certain things and not eat other things. But even that, if you're in a household of more than one, you'd have to share that kind of decision-making with someone else. And they may or may not agree, even inside the household. It has to be negotiated. But more importantly than that is our role as individuals. Call them individuals. I don't call them individuals, I call them persons. Not just as consumers. More importantly, I'll name a few examples. Parents. Is the parent able and willing to equip the children to handle the challenge posed by climate change in all aspects of life? Because if they don't do it, who else will? At least at an early age, the children. Similarly with educators, extraordinary responsibility to equip a new generation to rise to the challenge, to know the nature of the challenge and to have some ideas of how to respond to it. So individuals, but not just as consumers, but as parents, as educators, as members of a profession. I'm in the teaching profession. I am in part responsible for the institution in which I teach. And when the school or the university does not do its job, is my voice being heard? Don't just think consumption. Or I'm a member of an organization. It could be a business. When a decision is made and I'm in that, am I prepared to make my voice heard, however unpopular it may be? When I am a shareholder, do I make it my business to see with clarity how money is being invested for what purpose? If I belong to a super organization, do I follow closely their climate change charter and principles? And if it doesn't accord with it, do I make my position clear, preferably our position clear, not just one person? So for example, in my case, UniSuper, the university is one of the biggest super organizations in Australia. Well, there are now 10,000 people close to it who are petitioning those who run the organization to drastically change their investment policy. So, and finally, as citizen, as a member of the body politic, it's no use saying the political institutions are not up to the challenge, are not fit for purpose, which may be the case, in which case political institutions need to change. And it's my responsibility, preferably our responsibility, to change them and make them fit for purpose. It's no use saying the parliament and the political parties and the bureaucracy are not functioning as they should. If you're responsible ethically, you have to set about the task of changing them collectively through discussion and so on. So you see, ethical responsibility comes down to the person, but usually in a collective as well as individual sense. And I don't think that's as widely understood and deeply appreciated as it might be. And perhaps the discussions we're having here can help towards that end. Okay? We're not taking questions. You have questions. We can put them to our guest this evening. If I'm needed to say anything, I can, but he would be able to handle most of the questions, I'm sure, that you may think what I have had to say might provoke. Okay, time is very short. So I want to take you, we're going to break in a minute. It's just 5 or 6 minutes past the break time. So let's see what we can do. Now, one thing I'd like you to do, please have a look at your running sheets. Quickly, very quickly. Preferably with pen in hand, but you don't need to do anything this minute. But during the break, while you're sipping a cup of coffee or orange juice or whatever, please fill in that table. The size of your network, the extent to which you think your network has grown or shrunk, and where you place your network, the contacts you have with people, wherever they happen to live, people you know, people you have reason to be in touch with frequently or infrequently. So hopefully you've got some idea of that network. And if you don't know what your network is made up of, I've got news for you, nobody else does. Nobody else. Only I or you know what our respective networks, how they're made up and what how they function. So before we come back for brief conversation, please make sure you've ticked the right cell for each row, okay? And then we're going to ask in the 15 minutes we have when we come back, how easy or difficult is it for you to engage in conversation on important ethical issues like the ones thrown up by climate change? How easy, how difficult? And the second question, how diverse is your network? And do you think diversity of the network is a plus, a minus, or irrelevant? 2 questions. You may only have time for one, but do your best. I think we need a break. So let's go for that. Grab a coffee or food or whatever, and we'll be back within 15 minutes if we can. All right? Okay. Sorry? we have touched upon. All issues that we have been touching on to some extent already. He's the founder of Green Music Australia and has been a visiting fellow at the ANU's RegNet, was previously communications director for Green Leader Christine Milne, and has been a board member and campaigner at Greenpeace Australia. He has written widely in various media outlets and journals, including The Age, Canberra Times, ABC, and others. His first book, very recently published, Living Democracy, an Ecological Manifesto of the End of the World as We Know It. And I'm sure he'll refer to some of the themes that feature in the book. He has a band, 4-play string quartet. They have recorded 7 albums and toured nationally and globally, from Woodford Folk Festival to New York Carnegie Hall. And if we behave ourselves, we might even have a little taste of the music played by the 4-play string quartet. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Tim Hollo. There he is, and thank you very much for joining us, Tim. We're greatly looking forward to hearing from you, and after you've made your presentation, we'll have some conversation and questions to put to you, and then maybe a tiny bit of music as well. So the floor is yours. We greatly look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind invitation, Joseph, to speak with everyone tonight as part of this really excellent sounding series. The theme of ethics in a turbulent time, and the challenge that Joseph set me to ask whether ethics can help us chart a democratic course equal to the challenge of our time, is very exciting to me, and it was a delight to jump on board at the offer. What I want to bring to this conversation, riffing off the themes of my book, Living Democracy, is the concept of ecological ethics, what they might be, how their erasure has brought us to this point of polycrisis, multi-system collapse, turbulent times, and how reclaiming them can see us shift from fearing this moment as the end of the world to embracing it as the end of the world as we know it. Before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking tonight from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, where I live and work, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and still to come. I recognise and celebrate their deep, ongoing connection to country, their stewardship of this land since time immemorial, and the ecological wisdom of their culture, which I've been privileged to learn about from brilliant teachers, elders, and friends like Professor Mary Graham, Janara Gareng, and Adala Barker. The Indigenous understanding of interdependence with each other and with country, their institutionalising of relationality, informs my thinking very deeply. And it is, in my view, a system of ecological ethics. Now, when I talk about ecological ethics or politics or behaviour, I'll not uncommonly have people respond with, hang on, ecosystems don't have morals. The natural world is inherently amoral. It doesn't operate according to moral or ethical decision-making. It just is. And yes, that's true, as far as it goes. And at the same time, it's possible to look at the ecological world and draw from it clear principles that can inform and undergird moral and ethical decision-making. If you'll indulge me to really draw out what I mean by this, I'd like to read a few paragraphs from the book at the opening of the chapter entitled, What on Earth is Ecology? And it goes a little something like this. Ecology is life. Ecology is the birds, The bees, the bushes, the bugs in the soil, the burrowing beasts, the burbling babies of human beings, the bugs in the bellies of the beasts, which help them digest the remains of the birds and expel the nutrients which nourish the bushes, whose flowers are pollinated by the bees, and whose fruit the birds eat, expelling the seeds further up the mountain as they fly, enabling the bushes to grow higher up as the climate warms, because humans have cut down so many trees and burned the metamorphosed remains of so many ancient buried bushes and beasts. Ecology is the whole and its parts and the connections between them and the patterns they make as they connect and reconnect. From the smallest microbe made up of even smaller atoms to the whole life form of the biosphere itself, which ecological philosopher Timothy Morton defines as a total system of interactions between life forms and their habitats, which are mostly just other life forms. Ecology is the complex adaptive system of life itself, as well as of each individual and recombinant being which is part of the web of life. You are an ecosystem, a complex adaptive system made up of countless life forms, changing as you eat and breathe. I too am an ecosystem, and as you read these words, the ecology of me meets and interacts with the ecology of you, and the coffee I drank perhaps years ago now is stimulating your metabolism right now, altering your appetite and your mood, such that, who knows, you may decide to set up a veggie patch, join a renewable energy cooperative, or run for parliament. Ecology is coexistence. It's cooperation and competition combining in complexity which isn't always comfortable. Ecology is interdependence, the health of the whole and its constituent parts dependent on the others and the connections between them. Ecology is ambiguity, even contradiction. It looks different depending on which direction you're observing it from and where you think its edges lie. Ecology is ephemeral. Point to it. Unlike the whale breaching or the sea eagle diving, it's moved on before you can exhale. In ecology, the only thing that stays the same is change. So, amoral? Yes. But from this, it's possible to draw three concepts that are inherent to healthy ecosystems and that consequently can deeply inform moral choices, ethical behavior, ethical political action. Interdependence, diversity, and impermanence. By developing an ethics around interdependence, diversity, and impermanence, we can begin to see how political institutions need to be more inclusive and more deliberative rather than exclusive and adversarial. How economic practices need to be more cooperative and regenerative rather than competitive and extractive. How we need to move from systems of coercion to organising around coexistence. And crucially, how our assumptions about change making need to shift from a mechanistic model to one of emergence, working together to cultivate the circumstances out of which the world we need can emerge. What's sitting behind these ethical alternatives, inclusive, exclusive, deliberative, adversarial, regenerative, extractive, cooperative, competitive, is the shift over millennia from systems of governance, indigenous systems of governance, which acknowledge the darker realities of our nature and seek to suppress them through institutions and ethics that draw out our best instincts, into systems that effectively give in to and institutionalize our worst instincts. That's what I call, in my book, anti-ecology. And to quote one more paragraph, if ecology is characterized by interdependence, diversity, and impermanence, anti-ecology is defined by disconnection, domination, and the pretense of permanence. It starts by separating man from nature, man from woman, white man from other, defining each as a binary and establishing each as a relationship of dominance. It becomes the white man's burden to subdue the other, including women, colonized peoples, and objectified them. Anti-ecological culture erases the respectful we-they interdependence, depicting us as fundamentally selfish individuals in constant competition. Anti-ecology sees land, plants, animals, and even other humans as resources to be owned and from which to extract value. Refusing to accept limits to extraction, it invents the myth of eternal growth. It replaces a complex adaptive system with a simple machine, creating a mechanistic, deterministic mode of thought, valuing efficiency and disdaining uncertainty. By unleashing competition and driving expansion, it ironically leads to homogenization, erasing difference by creating monoculture. So, starting with the flip from the understanding that the country owns us to the idea that we can own, enclose, seek to control land and all within and on it. These values, these ethics, start to become encoded in our systems. Those systems, as I write, following the important work of people like James C. Scott and David Graeber, are incredibly fragile at first because people hate them. They seek self-direction, they flee, they rebel, they undermine them from within. Because ecosystems are self-correcting. They seek equilibrium. They're always itching at the margins, growing up through cracks in the concrete. But occasionally, these dominating and separating systems succeed for a time and develop into empires. We are living at the tail end of one of those periods, when a system of domination and separation that for the first time came to span the entire globe is reaching its only logical conclusion: collapse, polycrisis, multi-system collapse, the end of the world as we know it. Systems of government, social systems, economic systems, a whole lot of very basic stuff. Everything is failing at the moment. Ecosystems are collapsing and political systems are crumbling, from the US to Europe to Australia. Governments can't govern properly. Parliaments can't parley. Corporations aren't serving the needs they're set up to serve. You can't get a tradie to do basic jobs. What's happening? Well, in my view, what's happening is that having stripped out connection and interdependence and diversity and the possibility of change, both in our ethics and in our structures, governments and corporations have destroyed their own ability to get decent feedback, whether it's advice through the public service or public consultation or parliament or the ballot box, or through customer response or market signals. Government has become hopelessly adversarial and made negotiation and deliberation dirty words. Protest and lobbying work less and less. Electoral systems of all kinds are breaking under the strain of voters splintering in all sorts of directions. And then our Westminster system simply doesn't know how to deal with shared power arrangements or the need for urgency. And in a world where trust and connection have been destroyed, misinformation and conspiracy theories thrive, intersecting, of course, with the collapse of education and media. As another way into what's going on, it's useful, I think, to understand governing systems, as peace and nonviolence scholar Erica Chenoweth articulates them, as forms of conflict management. These myriad different forms are all different ways of managing conflict and making decisions, and the different models produce different outcomes. I would argue that what we currently have is a particularly problematic set of forms of conflict management, which have created this polycrisis and cannot solve it. It's poor conflict management because it's based on ethics of separation, domination, and pretense of permanence, with structures that are exclusive, adversarial, extractive, fixed. Good conflict management is about coming together across difference, being willing to listen to and hear different points of view, being willing to be creative, open to changing your mind. It has to be based on ethics of interdependence and diversity and impermanence. And it has to have structures that are inclusive and participatory, deliberative, regenerative, flexible. Let's step through this briefly. Separation makes itself felt in the individualism that runs through our representative politics, emphasized, of course, by capitalism. We're encouraged to always think of ourselves as individuals and discouraged from recognizing our collective power. The state is established as an entity separate from us, a distant bureaucratic and managerial entity with power over us, which we get to influence every now and then, but only through our vote. We're excluded from parliaments, from MPs' offices most of the time, certainly from ministers' offices, and from decision-making processes. Consultation, more often than not, is so desultory that it seems designed to disempower and disenchant, to discourage us from ever taking part again. Protest, of course, as already mentioned, is a complete no-no. It gets attacked as illegitimate, labelled as violent when it's usually not, made illegal more and more. It's been criminalised at every level. I believe the way we reverse this, finding real healthy joy together through connection with each other and the natural world. We can do that by developing agency in our own communities through mutual aid, cooperative action, and collective politics. Instead of the disenfranchising fake consultation, we can develop plans for our localities ourselves, together, organising in our communities. And we get so much deep joy from this, whether it's through community renewable energy cooperatives and microgrids, or local urban agriculture, or citizens' assemblies. When separation and domination combine, you get a system that is designed around and enforces adversarialism. And how do we think conflict management is likely to go when our processes essentially replicate medieval tournaments? Combatants seeking to defeat their opponents, compromise becomes a dirty word. Other parties are enemies to be destroyed. Adversarialism means our political discourse is appalling. It's a he said, she said, Monty Python-esque, yes it is, no it isn't nonsense. Governments refusing to negotiate or listen to advice from civil society always whine, oh, they won't play with me. You know, it's their fault. Protest, again, is criminalised. Minor parties and independents are marginalised and very frequently misrepresented. This ridiculous meme we've had for years of making the perfect the enemy of the good comes from this phenomenon. Nobody's trying for perfect in politics. We are so far from perfect. But negotiating parties wanting to improve and influence legislation are told through that meme to just get on board or get out of the way, and they're ridiculed for efforts to negotiate. How is that conflict management? How is that decent decision-making? Unfortunately, for all political participants, this also flows through into interpersonal behaviours in really destructive ways. The worst, in my view, is how people prioritise being correct instead of trying to change people's minds and behaviour. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. We get this performativity of demonstrating how in line with your team you are, and part of that is being dismissive as possible or extremely aggressive towards the other team. Instead of opening paths for people to understand our perspective with patience and compassion, to encourage them to join our work, we make enemies out of potential allies. And this is the case across the political spectrum, left, right, and the middle. We desperately need to rebuild the skills to come together across difference, skills that have been deliberately erased over recent generations. We need to learn to understand our entanglement, our shared common humanity. We need to learn skills of deliberation, and we need to create space for deliberation in our politics through well-facilitated processes at all levels. Citizens' assemblies, again, for example, are a model for conflict management and decision-making based on recognising and prioritising interdependence and diversity. These and similar models of participatory deliberative democracy don't just reverse the exclusion of representative politics, they also reverse adversarialism by pitching everyone in the room as active participants in finding a creative path forward together. They're about listening to each other, learning from each other, seeking to understand others' viewpoints, and working out how to find paths that satisfy as many as possible. It's the opposite of winning by defeating an opponent. Finally, permanence and impermanence. The mythology of Thatcher's "there is no alternative" and Bismarck's "politics is the art of the possible" which are deliberately designed to make it impossible to imagine a different world, to shut you down as at best a dreamer and at worst a dangerous radical if you dare to do so. And we all believe this mythology of permanence to certain degrees. It's incredibly persuasive and deeply embedded in our worldviews and the way we work. So one of the big challenges of a politics of impermanence, as articulated particularly beautifully by philosopher activists like Joanna Macy and Baiwa Komolafe, is to let go of control of goals, of KPIs, to hurry up and slow down and to trust to emergence. That if we establish the context for the world we want to emerge, it can and will do so. This is, for me, a prefigurative politics, proving that a different world is possible by living it into being ourselves, community by community. It's a pragmatic politics, a very grounded material imaginaries, where change is led by behavior itself. We don't try to change people's minds to make them change their behavior. We create the spaces in which people can change their behavior, and the ideas follow. And fundamentally, it's an ethical politics. It's about leading with ethical behavior, with ecological ethics of interdependence, diversity, and impermanence. And in these turbulent times, these are the ethics that we need to shift from the end of the world to the end of the world as we know it. Thank you. Look forward to the conversation. And I hope my internet connection will stay there.
Just 1 second. I think we've attended to it, so we can now begin our conversation. You've painted what for many people, I'm sure a number of people here online and in person, would regard as a very attractive vision, an alternative to what you've called the dominant state of affairs. So you've offered us a contrast between, to a large extent, what is and what could be in terms of inclusion, exclusion, permanence, impermanence, diversity, uniformity, and so on. But we need, don't we, to ask ourselves, how is it that we have got into this mess? And the fact of the matter is, and this is what I'm trying to draw you out on, there is a significant of powerful and wealthy institutions, as well as individuals, who regard themselves as doing extremely well from the way things are. Perhaps you might say in a narrow sense, but they have acquired the power to control things to a large extent.
Mm.
How does one move from where we are at now to where we might like to be? What are some practical pathways that are open to people, whether it is in this country, and we have people who are in other countries who have joined us this evening? How do we move from where we're at this point in time? We can use Australia as an example, to where it might be preferable to move to. What does the journey, the pathway look like? Are there some levers that one can use in moving forward? So tell us what you think.
That is obviously the crux of the question, isn't it? How does change happen? And I didn't really have time to sort of dig into that tonight. I do in the book. And my theory of change is one that draws on an ecological conception of the world, again, with an idea called panarchy, which is about systems of change interweaving with each other, and how when you get a whole lot of systems this growth and reorganization and collapse and reorganization lining up. You get these moments of possibility of transformative change when to take a step back from there, the point being that in our very kind of mechanistic modernity, we're told to think of evolution as a slow linear process, whereas in fact, what we know more and more now is it's actually what we call punctuated equilibrium. It swings from equilibrium to equilibrium, and when change happens, it happens incredibly fast, very frequently, moves from state to state. And those phase shifts, those state shifts happen when systems of connection and systems of what's been currently the way of being are crumbling. And what happens next in these moments depends on what's growing underneath and what the circumstances for growth are. So when, for instance, a forest burns, if a forest burns particularly badly, it can regenerate in its old form, or it can move into a completely different state, which is dependent on what's in the undergrowth, what's growing nearby, what the conditions for growth are. So my theory of change is based in no small part on the fact that, as I was saying, my view is that, and I think most of the people in the room would probably agree, the current systems of domination are actually already collapsing. Our economic systems, our governing systems, they're not working well anymore. And more people are understanding that they're not working well. And so the first step is to acknowledge that to ourselves. The first step is to recognize that we're at a moment of possibility. And then there's this kind of three-step process that I think needs to then happen. One is that we need to start actually growing what we want. So if what happens next depends on what's growing, we need to start growing the things that we like. So that is kind of the core goal for us, in my opinion, is whether it's urban agriculture or local citizens' assemblies and new systems governance, whether it's renewable energy cooperatives, whether it's workers and users cooperatives that we can rethink the economy with, all sorts of models like this. Community independence and Greens, alternative members of parliament, and then those members of parliament behaving in ways which are very much involving their communities. All sorts of models like this to grow the new system from the grassroots up. And to support the second step, so the first is sowing those seeds of change. The second step is to cultivate healthy soils, as I call it, so to support others doing similar things. So in modernity, in capitalism, we're told that the way that you scale anything has to be to just make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Whereas in ecosystems, the way you make scale is to replicate. You follow examples and you replicate and you do similar things in different places. So that's cultivating the healthy soil. If somebody sees the community garden that I'm part of and says, hey, I really like that idea, can I join? Instead of saying, yeah, join, we say, hey, we can show you how you do it. We can teach you and we can give you the instructions and you can do it yourself and bring in another 20 people down the road. So there's sowing the seeds and there's cultivating the soils. And then the third part, which goes to your opening point about people in power being very comfortable in power, is that we actually need to weed the ground. We need to, as I call it, withdraw our consent. So this to me is the fundamental point. I don't believe in kind of revolutionary takeover, because in an ecological conception, what you're doing is creating scorched earth in which it's very difficult to grow anything. Usually what happens through revolution is that you get a new and possibly even worse system of domination happening. So what I see the point as is we need to acknowledge that these old systems aren't working and we need to withdraw our consent from them. So again, for instance, in the community garden example, what we're doing when we're starting urban agriculture is firstly saying, yes, we want to do this ourselves. We want to grow our own food and support others to do so. But it's also saying we don't want to participate in the capitalist extractive food system anymore. We don't want to be forced to go and buy our food from a supermarket duopoly who are extracting value from farmers, extracting value from truck drivers, extracting value from workers, extracting value from us as consumers. We don't want to be part of that system. We're going to withdraw our consent from it and do it ourselves. So it's that I see as kind of the philosophical underpinning. Sow the seeds, cultivate the soils, withdraw consent, weed the ground. That can help us prepare the context, cultivate the circumstances in which this transformative change can emerge at the points when it's ready.
Going to push you one step further, if I may, because the things that you've mentioned, all of which are no doubt valuable, would take, assuming there was progression, still a very long time to work themselves through in terms of changing lifestyle, places of work, places where you live, ways you consume energy, etc., etc. All of which, no doubt, a good number of individuals have the option of at least attempting to do. Together and on their own and together with others. But this doesn't necessarily produce the kind of more dramatic social, economic and political change. For example, I happen to be one which would say, if we're taking the Australian example, that our political institutions are totally inept, including the party system, including the electoral system, including the constitution, and they have to be called into question. And that is a bigger platform. There is mining going ahead, which is causing untold damage. And that's proceeding even though some people may well be doing very nice things in their localities. So the question, it seems to me there is a sense of urgency about putting large institutions on the table as requiring change and fairly quick change. Now, that requires civic engagement. So a lot of energy and resources, human energy and resources, would need to go, not just about our own little garden, so to speak, but about the larger sphere, which is both national and, for that matter, global. While we're saying these things, nice things, Australia, for example, the UK and the US line up for an August agreement which includes 8 nuclear-powered submarines. What happens in the meantime, unless you call into question not just that policy, but the processes and institutions which led to it? Any reaction?
Yeah, so that's kind of precisely my point. We have to call into question not just the decisions and not just the people in those seats, but the systems themselves. And my point is that when we engage with these systems on their terms, we're not calling them into question and we're not actually changing them. So I am very much, so for instance, I've been an active climate campaigner for 25 years. And all through this time, not all through this time, for the last at least 15 years, I've been saying to a whole lot of people, we need to actually go to the core here, because we've been calling for action in the same way, essentially, for a quarter of a century, and we're not getting anywhere. We're losing very, very badly. The longer we keep engaging in this system, the more we will continue to lose. So this is precisely the point. People keep saying to me, we don't have time for that scale of change. And I keep saying, well, we're wasting year after year, election cycle after election cycle, decade after decade, by continuing to engage with it. Actually, if we step outside that and say, we don't have any faith anymore that these electoral systems, these representative democratic systems, vaguely democratic, not particularly democratic at all, are going to solve the problem. And instead of actually, as you were saying, build civic engagement in a system which has demonstrably failed, what if we built civic engagement in building a new one and withdrew our consent from that system? What if we said that's not going to work? and we can do it ourselves. I give the example of the garden because it's a lovely, very tangible example, but it's only a very small scale example. I agree. There are much, much bigger scales. One of the most exciting ones that I know of is in Barcelona, where in the face of the global financial crisis, there was disastrous unemployment and people being kicked out of housing, unable to get food, unable to get medical care. And a whole lot of mutual aid groups and cooperatives started popping up and supporting each other to actually live decent lives. Then what happened is a municipal election was coming up. And these grassroots mutual aid groups got together and decided to form what do they call it? A citizens platform. They didn't call it a party. They called it a citizens platform. They ran for government and they won. And they've been in coalition government in the city of Barcelona for 3 terms now, devolving power out of City Hall into the communities, where communities are self-organizing, making decisions about energy and water and planning and all sorts of things. And on top of that, they've also been holding these global scale meetings, what they're calling the Fearless Cities Network. And so they're actually starting to form an alternative geopolitics. Instead of saying, well, we'll leave geopolitics to the United Nations, which is a failed conglomeration of failed governments, we'll do it ourselves. We'll do it differently. We'll have grassroots up city governments which can work with and share ideas with city governments all over the world and start doing it faster. And to me, the speed of it comes from there's a beautiful phrase that a friend of mine uses, which is transformative incrementalism. It's flipping this idea of both transformation and incrementalism. So standard incrementalism is, if we need to go from A to Z, we need to go step by step, at the whole system level, A, B, C, D, all the way through to transform the system in that way. What transformative incrementalism says is, we can influence our local area and our communities and our connections, and we can take these areas, and if we build civic engagement and if we build these exciting, joy-filled projects, we can transform our area utterly really fast, as Barcelona showed, and other places. Kurdistan, I could give examples of. There's all sorts of places around the world. Indi, the electorate in Northern Victoria, has not just elected independence. It's really important to recognize that it's transformed its culture and its economy and its politics utterly. Indi, they've got community renewable energy cooperatives all over the place. They've got a flourishing local economy now in ways that they did not have before. You can transform an area really, really fast. And if you can transform that area fast, and you can support others to transform their area fast, piece by piece, we can actually transform the whole world incrementally, much faster than if we keep investing our trust in systems or try to recapture systems which are fundamentally structurally failed.
Okay, thank
That's
you
the theory.
for that. I think we'll open it up now to questions from the virtual floor and the physical floor here. Who would like to ask a question of Tim? Yes. You better come here, might be easier.
Thank you for your presentation. There are a lot of very interesting ideas, and I think I'd have to read your book to fully engage with them in the detail which they deserve. I wanted to pick up on one of your earlier points. You talked about engaging people in the room as active participants. How would you engage with someone for whom has quite a different view from you, who might say that the supermarket system is working for them because they, rather than spending time growing food in a community garden, that leaves them 2 hours to commute to work or go to the child's hockey game, or to someone who voted for one of the failed governments that you talk about in the failed conglomeration. How do you have those conversations so that the ideas that you've put across sort of scale to a broader subsect of society than the people in this room, perhaps, or in your networks?
So there's an incredible magic that happens when you set up a conversation in a deliberative way rather than an adversarial way. I was putting a pretty clear point of view tonight to a room which I knew was going to be relatively interested in that point of view. I wouldn't go out to somebody who I knew was coming from a very different perspective and put it quite in those terms quite so forcefully. There's a lot of skill involved in setting up political conversations that are about opening up space to find agreement. And there's amazing work being done on this at the moment. In particular, in America, there's some work being done in this, what they're calling deep canvassing, which is now being shown to be the only effective way so far found to shift Trump voters away from voting Trump and either towards deciding not to vote or even voting Democrat. And it happens by, instead of going and knocking on people's doors and kind of making a pitch to them, opening up a space for connection. So it starts usually by knocking on someone's door and saying, "Hi, we're here to have a conversation. Wanted to ask you really first off, can you tell us about an occasion when somebody in your community was there for you when you needed it? Can you tell us about a circumstance where you found real close connection with somebody when you weren't expecting it?" And by framing the conversation in those terms about interdependence and connection, you can then make a way into a conversation where you can talk to somebody who rejects the science of climate change, but will then be open to talking about clean energy, or who, believes that there are only two genders, but then might be willing to consider trans rights as human rights, these kinds of things. So in terms of that fundamental question of how do you talk to people who, for instance, might have voted in a particular way or might like the supermarket process, my response is we don't talk to them in those terms. My response is, in terms of food, for instance, what if we got folks together and said, what do you like about food? What do you need with food? How do you want to engage with food? The vast majority of people don't want supermarkets per se. No, I mean, very few people actually like the supermarkets. What they like is the convenience factor of being able to go in and get food. What if we said, okay, how do we solve that problem differently? What people, don't like about climate action is that they've been told through an adversarial political system that it's going to be risky, that it's going to be more expensive, that it's going to be, intermittent. What if instead of kind of trying to solve it in this adversarial political manner, we instead got people together and said, okay, how can we demonstrate here that it's going to be cheap, it's going to be affordable, it's going to be reliable, which it is. You change the tone of the conversation. That's, to me, what it's fundamentally about. And to Joe's point about, the political system is structurally unsound. To me, it's fundamentally structurally unsound because it is designed around adversarialism. When you ask questions and try to answer them in adversarial ways, you get really difficult, problematic conversations. When you flip that script and bring people together and talk about, what do we care about? What do we need? How can we work together to satisfy our needs together? You have a radically different conversation.
Thank you. Another question from the floor, and then we'll go to people online. Yes.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. My main question to you is sort of more related to how we can, my question's sort of broken up into two parts, so I'm going to go through both of those parts. The first part is, you mentioned multiple times that you think that the current system that we are abiding by is fundamentally flawed because of the principles on which it's founded upon. My question to you is, for the first part, is when we're trying to create new systems, can we take inspiration from the good aspects of the old system? Or should we discard it completely and just build it from the ground up based on new principles? That's the first question. The second question is more related to, it's sort of an extension of the first part, which is if that's the case, we can take those good aspects from the existing system. How could how could, for example, in a community, could we develop systems such that businesses, schools, universities, research institutions, and even municipal governments can work together to identify specific sustainability problems and then figure out effective solutions to those local problems? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Pondering the second part, my answer to the first part very briefly is yes, absolutely. There are always going to be aspects of existing systems that we like, that we want to maintain. And that's how change happens in ecosystems as well, I guess, is the point. And it's not a selective process. It's not an active selective process. It's an evolutionarily selective process. But that is how change happens. You take the bits that are working well and you maintain them and you grow them. And you choose the bits that are particularly problematic and you select out. So yes, of course, there are going to be things that are very beneficial. For instance, one of the things I think about a lot is, mine is not a view that says modernity has created all of these problems. We should throw out everything that modernity has created. I mean, for goodness sake, modern medicine, we need to keep, what modern medicine has created in so many ways. Not all of it, of course, but, I'm reliant on arthritis drugs to keep me moving. I don't want to lose them. So, there's a lot, I'm sure, in these systems that we will want to keep. For instance, I think, in the political system, Australia has a remarkably good electoral system. I would like our politics to move away from electoralism drastically. That's not to say we won't have some elements of representation. Of course we will. There will always need to be, in a large and complex society, there'll always need to be some element of representation. Australia has developed an extraordinarily successful and highly, highly credible electoral system. We should use it when we want to use it. In terms of kind of how we build that through kind of cooperation and municipal governments and things like that, to me, I mean, again, this is actually an area where there's some really good options already on the table. Local government is a really fascinating one, in that ALGA, the Australian Local Governments Association, is actually a really effective body bringing together local governments, councillors from around the country, in a way which is about sharing their insights, sharing their learnings, and building on each other's good work. The problem that they have is that local government is so appallingly under-resourced in Australia that they can't do a lot of the things that they want to do. But yeah, to me, the answer to that second part of the question is fundamentally about how do we get better at sharing what we're doing, learning from each other, and trying to replicate in different ways. What we tend to see in our system is that people copy the worst. Australia's atrocious treatment of refugees has been exported all around the world. And the people who are trying to destroy are very good at copying what they do, what each other do. We're much less good at doing that in positive ways, although that happens too. I think one of the good examples there actually is that the growth of Barcelona en Comú, that commons-based Barcelona government, drew a lot on the Occupy movement. It drew a lot on what was happening all around the world of people facing the disaster of capitalism collapsing around them through building new engagement themselves, deep grassroots deliberative processes. So there are ways that we can learn from each other as well. And yeah, we need to get better at it.
Okay, now, online participants, anyone would like to
Question in the chat, Christian. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, then. I hope you can hear me. I'll read it. I've written it down, Tim, but I just thanked you for a really enlightening talk. And I was particularly interested in your view that by seizing on the possibilities for collective forms of engagement through things like renewable energy cooperatives and citizens' assemblies, changes in ideas would follow. So much of our discussion's been about shifting paradigms, ideologies, and mindsets. In essence, changing hearts and minds. But if I understood you correctly, it's a little bit more the other way around. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit more on this and following that, perhaps address the question, what kinds of conversations would be important here?
Yeah, thanks for picking up on that. That's something that's been a really big shift in my thinking recently. You know, I like most of us kind of was brought up into a world where we assume that change happens by changing people's minds and their behavior will follow. And kind of psychology and neuroscience really clearly tell us that the opposite is the case. That actually the best way to change somebody's mind about something is to change their behavior. And you know, I learned about that in a few different ways. One is as a musician, that you don't learn to be a better musician by thinking about it and changing your mind. You learn by practice. You practice your damn scales, and once you know your scales and your chords, you can be creative. You can think all sorts of wonderful things through your music once you know how to do it. You know, a second path that I really came to it with was, interestingly enough, with, you know, we've been having this conversation about adversarialism and deliberative democracy. Deliberative, you know, citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy is one of those things where you can talk till you're blue in the face about it, and people won't believe you until they experience it. You give somebody an experience of being in a well-run citizens' assembly and they're a convert for life, because they see it, they feel it. It's so tangible how it works. So it's really, to me, you know, about creating the spaces for people to find their way forward. And a lot of the time, that's going to be behavioral. And once their behavior moves in a particular direction, they're really open to changing the way they think. That's one of the things about deep canvassing as well that I was saying before. You just start a conversation with someone in a different way, in a way that opens them up to thinking across difference, and they can do so. Anyone can do so. So yeah, that I guess, you know, to me, that's what I try to get to. And it's really crucial in terms of, you know, paradigm shifts, as you were saying as well in that question. You know, the work of Donella Meadows, and others in terms of systems thinking, in the 60s and 70s, where, you know, they were talking about points of intervention in systems that we like to try to intervene kind of at the pointiest bit. And if there's a particular species that is struggling, we want to kind of try to deal with that species. Or if there's a particular price point or something in a market which isn't working, we want to deal with that. And you need to go step down into the paradigms. And it is about shifting in that way. But what I think is slightly different about it is thinking that you don't shift the paradigms by talking about the paradigms. You shift the paradigms by shifting the operation of them. Once we move ourselves step by step, piece by piece, out of adversarialism into deliberation, and we do that by practice, that is the paradigm shift. And that's when the change, which is eluding us through the current system, can suddenly happen really fast. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Okay. Yes. Who are the two?
I can see two hands online, Robert and Rolf. We've only got a few minutes left. So if you wanted to take take a moment, but only a moment.
Could I
Okay.
just quickly ask Tim, when he says withdraw consent, which I don't disagree with, what comes next?
Well,
Tim?
it has to go in in line with the seeding of the new. So if we withdraw consent too early, if we kind of say we're not going to operate on those terms, but we don't have the alternatives ready, then what comes next is problematic. So it's got to go hand in hand, in my view, with that. Sowing the seeds of change, doing the new stuff ourselves, and then saying, okay, we're ready. We don't need you anymore.
Thanks.
Okay, the other one?
Yeah, Tim, it's Ralph. In my experience, change often happens opportunistically, both at the personal level and at the national level. For example, in my local community house, a person started speaking very negatively about Aboriginal Australians, and others wanted to jump on her, but I persuaded them to listen, and she eventually exposed the errors in her thinking, and it was very easy then to encourage her to rethink, because we listened with respect first.
Beautiful.
And she has changed. And I think a great example at the national level is what happened after the Port Arthur massacre, a horrible tragedy. But I'm sure it wasn't a majority of the Conservatives, and probably not a majority of Australians who would have voted for the gun controls, but it certainly served as well. It's not ideal and it's not perfect, but it did cause a change to occur. And with climate, we're really at a crisis point. Tipping points we're facing the tipping point. We need to find an opportunity to have people take the courage to make the changes.
Completely agree. Change is very opportunistic at all sorts of scales. And I guess that, that's another way of looking into what I'd suggested about these systems are already in polycrisis. That is the opportunity. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher from 100 or so years ago, wrote about how when you're at a moment when, as he said, the old world is dying and the new is struggling to be born, these are the moments when remarkable change can happen. So yes, what we need to do is work out how we can find those moments to make the big change. The transformation in Barcelona happened because of the global financial crisis. It happened because people were desperate. There's amazing things going on in Lismore and the Northern Rivers at the moment, where they've been devastated by 2 massive floods in a row, and government is nowhere to be seen. The Reconstruction Authority that New South Wales set up is a schmozzle, but the community's doing it for themselves. They're setting up they're kind of socializing squats, basically. Community groups are getting together and they're cleaning up homes, they're making them livable, and people are living in them. They're doing community food services. They did the rescue services themselves because the SES wasn't able to do it. And that's no blame on the SES individuals. There's amazing stories about how the SES individuals who were there were getting direction from Central not to do certain things, so they just took their uniforms off and did it themselves. These moments absolutely are the moments that we need to seize, but to seize not just in order to address the specific, but to build a new, to find our pathway that's kind of our transformative incrementalism. So we transform this space in the light of that crisis, and then we see the path towards the next steps.
Thanks, Tim. In 1 minute, I will thank you properly on behalf of all of the participants here. But just before I do, because we are going to finish off on a musical note, I'd like to foreshadow next week, which will be another packed program. And what we're going to do is look at, especially at states as institutions, and we're going to look at those which, even from, forget about ethical, from a legal perspective, are engaging in various forms of criminal activity. That is to say, they may be corrupt. There are lots of corrupt governments all over the world. intensely corrupt, politically corrupt, that manipulate elections, corrupt in a financial way, enormous filling of pockets with basically taxpayers' money, and then corruption at the military level, war crimes, etc. So we're going to pose the question, when those who seemingly are guardians of the law break it, who guards the guardians? That's the question. And to help us, apart from our own contributions and mine, we have invited one of the leading scholars in this field, an American professor of international relations from the University of California at Santa Barbara. So she'll be joining us, written extensively around this theme. One of her many areas of interest was what happened at Guantanamo Bay as part of the war on terror, and how the hundreds and hundreds of people who were dispatched there were treated. And quite extraordinarily, she's made 14 trips to Guantanamo Bay herself in a personal way. Lisa Hadjar, okay? American to the bootstraps, but it sounds non-Anglo. Okay, so that's next week. So back to where we were this evening. Tim, I want to thank you very sincerely for a stimulating sharing of ideas, which are very close to you intellectually and emotionally, and for helping to deepen our conversation about, well, if you like, the link between ecology and, in a sense, democracy, how it can be made. They're both in crisis, and how we can move from crisis to renewal simultaneously, if we can, on both fronts. I think that was the central message of what you had to tell us, and we're very grateful for sharing that with us. And we would love, of course, in the time ahead, to continue the connection with you and the conversation. Thank you very, very much. But before you go, please give us a moment's introduction to the piece you have selected that we're going to play in a moment. Just
Thank
a
you.
word about the background to it.
Yeah, sure. So this was actually a song that I wrote after my band had been flooded into a rehearsal down on the Shoalhaven River, and yeah, the river broke its banks, and we were stuck behind it, and my daughter was calling, kind of, from home in Canberra, stressed out about it, and said to me in one of these conversations, "I wish that I'd been born before climate change happened." And so this song came pouring out of me. I wrote this song about how we can't wish away the times we've been given. We have to live in them as they are. And also the belief that we will do what's right, because humans are remarkable at choosing the right path eventually. So yeah, that's what this is about. And a friend of mine made a lovely music video for it, using beautiful footage of climate disasters and climate action.
Well, thank you again, and here it is.